Well, I would like to say good afternoon to everyone. Good to see you. I know we have quite a number of absences, but we have visitors too, so welcome. So good to see you again, and it's so good to hear a little child's voice. We don't have enough of them in this congregation, so again, welcome. I'm going to take the sermonette time to actually give a sermonette, and I'll tell you as I close why I'm doing this. Sometimes there is a mark of shame or discredit associated with the place you are from. I remember quite well an announcer years ago on the WCCO radio station who actually gained a lot of prominence in the broadcasting world. He at one time had, if not the most, one of the most popular, what they call drive time afternoon radio shows of anyone in the US. Yet, he resented the fact that people sometimes look down on him because he was an Iron Ranger. Do you know what that means? Those who grew up in the Iron Range in Minnesota, up there in the iron mines, places like Virginia, Eveleth, Hibbing. He was from there and he didn't like the stigma. Now that word, stigma, has a dictionary definition of being a mark of shame or discredit for something associated with you, and in this case, where you grew up. So again, he didn't like the fact that he couldn't seem to shake that association, even though he became actually famous in the broadcasting world. He knew that the Rangers, as they sometimes call themselves, or the Iron Rangers, were known for fighting, heavy drinkers, generally lacking in education and simply not sophisticated, like those in the Twin Cities or most everywhere else. Now, Diane can tell you about association like that where she grew up. There is a stigma that goes with being from East St. Louis. Now, Diane's not from East St. Louis. She is from St. Louis, though, the greater metro area there. She grew up in a middle-class suburb in the northern part of the metro, but East St. Louis. I don't know if anyone is very aware. It's actually on the Illinois side, other side of the river. I decided to look that up. It hasn't shed its reputation at all. As a matter of fact, I copied into my notes a couple of exact sentences from the Wiki Travel website. Here's what it says. Warning. Warning is in all caps, bold, and red font. Warning. East St. Louis has, quote, the highest crime rate in the United States in the FBI's 100 most dangerous cities list and is perceived by many as America's most dangerous city. So it still holds true today. There's a stigma attached to being from there or actually living there. Now, what am I getting at? Here's the subject of the sermonette. The stigma of being from Galilee. Are you aware of that? It's kind of fascinating if you study it. There is a stigma associated in Bible times in being from Galilee. Let's turn to Acts 2. I'm going to define this in only 3 scriptures, but in Acts chapter 2, we have the account of the first Pentecost being observed after Christ's crucifixion, consequently, the first New Testament Pentecost. And I won't read much of the context, but you know, when that day had fully come, as the chapter begins, there were these miraculous signs, a mighty rushing wind, maybe almost tornadic. There were suddenly this visible, it says, tongues of fire on the persons of those who were assembled, who were truly being called by God. And then, of course, in one sense, the most miraculous sign of all was these men suddenly able to speak fluently in foreign languages, because at the time of that feast of Pentecost, there were many in Jerusalem from many, many countries, and suddenly they're hearing the truth, as it says, in their own languages. Now, what I want to get at is in verse 7, Acts 2, verse 7. It says, then they were all amazed and marveled, saying to one another, look, are not all these who speak Galileans? And how is it that we hear each in our own language in which we were born? That's the fact they could speak fluently in languages they didn't previously know is miraculous, but it seems again, why does it say, are not all of these who speak Galileans? It's the stigma. In Barnes' notes on the Bible, it says Galileans, or the inhabitants of Galilee, were found, or it was found rather remarkable that they could speak in this manner because, one, they were ignorant, rude, and uncivilized. That's how that region of Galilee was perceived. Continuing, hence the term Galilean was used as an expression of the deepest reproach and contempt. Two, their dialect, how they spoke, was proverbially barbarous and corrupt. It continues, they were regarded as an outlandish people, unacquainted with other nations and languages, and hence the amazement that they could address these other people in the refined language of other people. Their native ignorance was the occasion of making the miracle more striking. So again, here it is in the Bible, a stigma associated with being from Galilee, and yet these are the people God used. Back up to John, the previous book of the Bible, John chapter 1. In John chapter 1, in the latter part of the chapter, we have the account of John the Baptist identifying Jesus Christ as the Messiah. Matter of fact, if you glance at verse 36, John 1:36, looking at Jesus as he walked, he, that is John the Baptist, said, behold the Lamb of God. And so people are hearing this. And what I want to emphasize is one who heard was Philip. Verse 45. Verse 45, Philip found Nathanael. Now, they're going out to tell others about this. And here's what he said. Middle of verse 45, we have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Now, Nathanael's immediate reaction is in verse 46, and he says, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Here's the stigma. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Philip's answer was pretty wise. Instead of arguing, he said, well, you come and see. Now, if you doubt that this is all associated, turn further back in the Bible with me to Luke chapter 2. This is not a companion account of the same the same happening. This is yet earlier in Luke chapter 2, Verse 22, I'll have you glance at that with me because this defines the context here of Joseph and Mary carrying out the requirements of the old covenant for their newborn son, who was Jesus. So in Luke 2, verse 22, it says, now when the days of her, that's Mary's purification according to the law of Moses, were completed, they brought him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. And then they do the sacrifices required and so forth. What I want to do is skip ahead and make the association here. It says in verse 39, so when they had performed all things according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee. Now that's a region. They returned to Galilee, to their own city, Nazareth. So here's Nazareth up in this region of Galilee, perhaps 80 miles or a bit north or a bit more north of Jerusalem. But that's their hometown. That's where Jesus grew up. And Nathanael said, can anything good come out of Nazareth? It's a real stigma. I want to draw a couple of conclusions to this. God often calls people from pretty humble backgrounds and places of origin. What about you? What about me? My hometown is so obscure. Astoria, South Dakota. Who knows? Well, my friend Clayton will know where that is. We grew up less than 20 miles from one another. If anyone else knows, you know South Dakota geography pretty well. I don't want to dwell on that too long, but it's interesting. A tiny little high school in its heyday had perhaps 75 students in all, not in a class, in all 4 grades, freshman through senior. My class was one of the smallest, 10. You want to guess how many people God called out of that tiny little town and who attended that high school? 11 of us. Now, some have died. 3 or 4 have, I'll simply say, left the faith, at least for now. But God called from that obscure little place 11 of us through the years. I'm not going to turn there, but it reminds me of some of the phrases at the very end of the first chapter of 1 Corinthians. You remember some of those? Paul was reminding them, you see your calling. By the way, Corinth was quite a city in its day, too. A city with a pretty bad reputation, although it was a large one. But he said, you see your calling, brethren. Not many wise, not many noble. Remember those phrases? But God has called the weak things, the base things, to confound the mighty. The things which are despised is another phrase there. God has chosen. And then it ends that no flesh, none of us can glory in his presence. The reason I wanted to take the sermonette time and deliver this sermonette is it's something of an introduction to the Bible study series I want to begin this coming Wednesday evening on the life of Peter. Peter was a Galilean. And it's going to be interesting to see how God used him mightily, even though he came from just a little fishing village. We'll continue that in the Bible study. But again, very interesting what being from Galilee meant in people's minds in Bible times. It can be the same for many of us, perhaps most of us. But I hope and pray we can be used mightily in God's hands, just as Peter and others were. Even Jesus Christ who in his human life was from the region of Galilee.